All right, so the next thing I want to look at is the idea of openness. And this comes partially from systems theory and thermodynamics and new biology, as well as Gestalt theory and phenomenology. Openness means, it's opposed to closedness. And closeness implies static. Everything is a set of parts, a finite set of parts that interrelate with each other. And there's no really external influx of change or relationality to a closed system versus an open system, which is dynamically interrelated with other open systems. So that's the basic view of openness. But in Merleau-Ponty, he's using these same sort of notions in order to explain perception and our embodiment. And here he is really in line with Gestalt psychology, which we're going to get to in a minute. But he takes these ideas much further than even the Gestalt psychologist did, I think, and really draws out the implications of these in ways that the early Gestalt psychologists kind of failed to do. So for Merleau-Ponty, openness applies in many different aspects of our lived experience, many different phenomenon. For instance, the world is something, and the natural world are open systems. The world is an interlocking system of perspectives, right? We've talked about horizons already. So when we perceive a certain milieu, a certain space, there's always this implied sense of other perspectives on the environment that we're perceiving. And we see them as interconnected. And this Merleau-Ponty refers to as transition synthesis, which he gets from Husserl, which basically means that through a certain transition, we could gain another perspective on the landscape or something like that by moving around and shifting those horizons, right? The shifting of horizons is a kind of transition synthesis. So that implies that the world, that a milieu, that the natural world are open. They're open to an inexhaustible modulation of perspectives and views on that world. And this applies also to perception. In perception, we modulate the way in which we perceive objects, and we adapt to those differing conditions, as well as being able to habituate ourselves in new ways and adapt to situations in new ways. So our perceptual apparatus, or our habit body, the body schema, is something adaptable and plastic, right? Plasticity. And therefore it's something open. It's like an open system. And this applies to life in general. Living systems are open systems far from equilibrium, as Ilya Prigogine, the thermodynamic botanist or biologist and chemist, called it. That's the idea of dissipative structures, a structure which is continually evolving and dynamically adapting to its changing relationality with the world. So openness describes this dynamic temporalization of reality as ordered structures and patterns. And it really emphasizes the plasticity and this kind of like self-regulating maintenance of that stability, maintaining a certain structure or pattern. And we can think here again of norms as being open and not as closed. So you could have a view of norms as closed, and that's often what physical institutions do. an institution says these are our rules and they're set and they can't change and you have to abide by them. And in some sense, that can be a good and a necessary thing. You can think of the way institutions need to protect different groups. But, obviously institutions have tended to do the opposite of that and used norms and patterns in order to exploit people, right? But those norms are not actually universals. They're not actually, inscribed in the fabric of reality. They're contingent and created and change, and therefore norms in general are also open and adaptable and plastic. So this idea of openness connects to another problem in perception called property constancy, or the constancy hypothesis. So Merleau-Ponty, again, I've said this before, that there are certain terms like project that Merleau-Ponty uses both positively and negatively. And this is one of those where it has both positive and negative senses, and we need to be able to disambiguate when he's using it positively and when he's using it negatively. So the constancy hypothesis is something he attacks strongly, and that he follows Gestalt psychology in attacking. But there is a sense in which constancy is going to be a positive term for him. So we'll get to that eventually. But this gets at the way in which we view objects or things in the world in various conditions, changing conditions, and yet we recognize the same object, right? So I might see something in varying lighting conditions or from varying angles, and the perceptual image that I'm getting varies massively from one to another context, and yet I'm able to see that it's the same object, right? So from that ability that we have, certain empiricists and psychologists formulate what Merleau-Ponty calls the constancy hypothesis, and it basically argues that the object, the thing, is closed. It is not open to an infinity of perspectives and sense-making gestalts, but is rather has one sort of objective way of being viewed, and we have some understanding of that object, and when we see that object in its deformed, modulation based on varying conditions, we infer that, in fact, that is the object that we know in an ideal way, and we are, reasoning backwards, saying, okay, what I'm seeing is just a distortion of that pure perspective on the thing. And what this gets at is this idea of this pure perspective, that there can be a view that kind of eliminates all perspectival deformations. And this idea Merleau-Ponty rejects. He rejects that there's any sense of objects as having a pure objective perspective on them. That you can eliminate things like perspectival angle, lighting condition, or parallax when when objects are arrayed in different orientations to one another. So this view from nowhere is essential to the constancy hypothesis and to empiricism, that there's a kind of ideal norm to the thing, and that ideal norm is a property of the thing, that it's the thing itself that determines that norm. And in fact, Merleau-Ponty wants to say, no, this norm is only a sort of embodied, optimal way of interacting with that thing based on our projects. It's not a view from nowhere. It's a privileged way of embodying our relationship to things. And it can be different in different projects, right? That's the main idea. So there's this closure of the object in empiricism and in the constancy hypothesis that Merleau-Ponty is trying to break down. That there's this absolute clarity and a kind of exhaustive, on the other hand, exhaustive sense-making that occurs when we view it as a objective thing existing in an ideal perspective. From this kind of ideal perspective, you would know everything about the object. It has no depth, it has no horizon, it has no temporalization, there's no ambiguity, and there's no perspectival richness. There's none of this transition synthesis where I can view it from another perspective, either perspectively perceiving it in a different perspective, or a gestalt shift of my intentionality, which makes it appear differently as well. So all of that becomes excluded by the objective thetic consciousness and the empiricist view of the constancy hypothesis. So there is still this sense of constancy from Merleau-Ponty that he wants to keep. He does think that there is some existential meaning to constancy. We do think that there is an object that, varying perspectives on it get at, right? So we might see it, with a shadow. We might see a painting or something with a shadow on it, and we don't think it's a completely different object just because the image is varied. Or if someone's standing in front of the painting, we don't think that's a completely different object because the image on our retina is different. So there is something to constancy that we need to account for. But the way he does it is very different from the way that I just outlined. There's something about nature he wants to say that has a constancy to it. So we always think of nature in the same way, basically. That's all I'm going to say for now, because the idea of it, and we don't think about it, but it's not that we think about nature in the same way, but it's that we relate to nature as nature always constantly being nature. So I'll get to what that means in the course of this it's part of the essence of nature that it involves ambiguity, depth, horizons, horizonality, that it's a space, a milieu of intersubjective life, that it has a sort of temporality to it, that it, exceeds and goes beyond thetic consciousness. So those are kind of constant properties of the natural world. The natural world has certain constants to it. They're just not the constants that empiricism ascribes to it. And yeah, so that idea of ambiguity, which I've gotten at, it comes through the idea of depth, horizonality, intersubjectivity, temporality. All of those aspects of our embodied life involve ambiguity, right? Ambiguity is an excess of sense-making potential. It opens up an inexhaustible depth of meaning and sense and sensitivity, an infinite number of perspectives and new modulations of intentionality and norms, which we can't predict right now. New gestalts can emerge, which our current consciousness doesn't understand, doesn't have, the rubric to interpret, that allows for kind of ambiguity to existence, that says something can emerge which we don't yet understand. So all of that falls under the umbrella of ambiguity and is extremely important for Merleau-Ponty and this sense of openness that his philosophy really depends on.